I just filmed an entire workshop and there was some audio issues. So I'm just going to go ahead and film it again right now to make sure that I can get this content and this information out to everybody. Today, I want to talk about things that can make the Smith Manoeuvre fail and misconceptions that people have about the Smith Manoeuvre so that I can go over all these issues. I can talk about them openly and honestly because it's important that people know what they're getting into if you're interested in this. So let's jump into some of the most common ways for the Smith Maneuver to fail. So number one, account commingling and tracing issues. In order to deduct interest on your home equity line of credit that you're going to be using for investments, you have to make sure that it's a clean HELOC. And by that, I mean, you have to make sure that all the funds that you're using from your HELOC are going towards genuine, compatible investments. And that usually means that they have a reasonable expectation of earning an income. So it's great if you follow the right guidelines and make all the right investments, but on top of that, you need to be able to prove to the CRA that that's actually true. And so there are specific ways and strategies that you can take to make sure you're setting yourself up in a way that will allow you to prove to the CRA that every dollar used has been used for an investment. And that's where a Smith Manoeuvre certified professional is going to come in really handy because there's standard ways to do things. As long as you follow those standard ways to do things, it's pretty rock solid that you'll be able to show the CRA exactly what they want to see if they ever come audit you, and then you'll be able to continue on deducting the interest just like you were meant to be doing. Issue number two, or fail point number two, is the wrong mortgage error. So I've seen on forums and things like that, people try to do the Smith Maneuver, especially DIY people try to do the Smith Maneuver using incompatible mortgage products. So things like they'll try to do a regular mortgage with a HELOC and do Smith Maneuver. And the problem is you actually can do that, but you're likely to run out of room in the long term. And so if you don't have a readvanceable HELOC like you're meant to, and just for those of you that don't know what a readvanceable HELOC is, that means when you pay down your principal, you don't lose that borrowing room. You can maintain the same amount of borrowing room. So when you pay down your principal, that borrowing room that you've just paid off will open up in a home equity line of credit. So if you pay down $100,000, you're going to get $100,000 worth of HELOC room available to you. And so it just keeps the power in your hands and out of the bank's hands, gives them no ability to reject you for that. Some people will try to do the Smith Maneuver with a regular mortgage, and the problem is after 4, 5, 6 years of doing this, you're taking all these deductions out, your HELOC room is going to run really low. And if you get to a point where you've maxed out your HELOC and you need either a new product or a readvanceable mortgage like you should have had in the first place, it's up entirely to the bank's discretion whether they grant that to you. So you've given the power back to the bank, and we want to make sure we're in control of our financial future. So we don't want to do that. Another example is to have the wrong setup. So for example, there's standardized ways to do things like I mentioned for tracking. If you don't have that right setup, it can be really messy and tricky come CRA time. And so you want to make sure you know which accounts to set up and how to do things for the bank side of things as well as the investment side of things. Make sure you're set up correctly there. And the third thing that trips a lot of people up, especially rental owners, is having the right amount of prepayment privileges. If you have a rental property, you have to pay really close attention to which lender you're going with because there's a huge variance in the prepayment privileges that banks and lenders offer. So normal mortgages, you're not going to worry about that. But if you're putting an extra $1,500 or $3,000 from rental income as a prepayment to your mortgage, there's a really good chance that you can max out your prepayment privileges. I'll use RBC as an example. A lot of DIY people will really love RBC for this because they have a readvanceable mortgage, they have great rates, and it seems like the perfect situation. But when you look deeper into the mortgage commitment that you get, your prepayment privileges are some of the worst in the industry. You get 10% prepayment privileges most often, and those privileges are only allowed once per year. So you can't continually month after month be making prepayments to your mortgage because you're only allowed to do it once per year. And so there may be some products they don't have that, but that's standard. You want to make sure you're working with a professional that can keep that in mind. And often if you have really high rental income, you might need a product that's extremely flexible, like a Manulife One that has no prepayment limits whatsoever. You can make all the prepayments in the world as long as you set up the mortgage correctly. So that's a really big red flag or stumbling block that people can walk into that makes this situation, this strategy fail. Investing in the wrong asset type, so a CRA violation. So When you're using borrowed money to invest, the thing that makes it tax deductible is that it produces an income. That is the regulation that we have to pass, the standard that we have to pass. It's really easy to do that. Most stocks, or any stock that produces a dividend, is going to qualify automatically because that is income coming back to you. A rental property is a good example of an investment because you're getting that rent back to you. Even things like lending your money out for private lending, you're getting that income, that interest back. That qualifies as an income producing asset, and it qualifies for a tax deductible investment loan. The tricky part comes when you look at assets that don't specifically have an income. So I often will refer to Tesla. Tesla not only doesn't produce an income, or doesn't produce a dividend rather, but it also has said it has no intentions of producing a dividend. So would you be able to justify to a CRA auditor that you have a reasonable expectation of income if you were investing in Tesla? Maybe. They have the ability to give you a dividend if they wanted to. Does that qualify? That's a case of something that's a gray area. It's never been taken all the way up to the Supreme Court, so we just don't know definitively if it's right or wrong. What I always advise clients is to invest in things that actually produce a dividend. It does not matter the size. It could be 1 cent a quarter, but if it produces a regular dividend, that is considered income and it makes it qualified for the strategy. In fact, I recently talked on a social media video about the Ludco Supreme Court case. And that was the case that said it doesn't matter the amount of income you make. It doesn't even matter if the income is the primary reason for the investment. But as long as income is present, it qualifies as a tax deductible expense when you use it as the investment loan that you use to buy it qualifies as a tax deductible expense. Other things that you may be worried about are when assets change use. So for example, if you have a home that you live in and you one day want to upgrade to another home that's bigger or whatever, and you decide to rent out your first home instead of selling it, that first home is now no longer a primary residence, is considered a rental unit. And you need to make sure that the change in use happens very clearly and distinctly. And so if you're not careful, it's very easy to mess that up. And you'll want to make sure you work with a really qualified accountant, like a Smith Manoeuvre certified accountant, when you're going through something like that, to make sure it's done correctly and that you can experience the full tax deductions that you should be, and you're not going to trip any tripwires that are going to wreck the strategy for you. So yes, it can be done. Has to be really careful. Another example is if you own a property, for example, that you're renting out and it stops producing rental income. So for example, say you were renting out a cottage or a small house in a beach town and you wanted to use it as a vacation property all of a sudden. Then when it stops producing an income, it's no longer the loan that you use to satisfy the expenses is no longer a tax deductible expense. The income producing asset is no longer producing income. So all the debt that you've used from that point to satisfy expenses on that property, that's no longer tax deductible. You have to separate that from the rest of the loan and pay it back differently, or however, handle it differently, make sure it's separated, because otherwise there'll be a commingled fund. So you have to be really careful when things change the way they're producing income or the change in use happens. Yield chasing. Right now, especially, I'm seeing a lot of stuff online. Now, I qualify, I'm not an investment specialist, but I do follow a lot of investment stuff. And I'm seeing a lot of stuff about like covered call ETFs and things like that. Sometimes funds can produce 8 or even 10+% returns to the investor. And that's amazing. And you might think that's kind of like a golden ticket for the Smith Maneuver because you get 10%, you prepay your mortgage, pull it out, buy more. But the problem is the 10% you're getting in almost all these cases, all of them I would assume, is going to be at least a mix of dividends and return of capital. Now, those are extremely different, but they look the same. And so a dividend can be run through the Smith Maneuver perfectly. A return of capital is technically the investment giving you your money back. And so it cannot be then run through the Smith Maneuver again. That money, if you're taking it out, actually has to go back onto your investment loan to pay that down. And so it does not work with the Smith Maneuver. Now, if you buy those stocks and just have it reinvest in itself when it gives a return, that's totally okay. But you can really mess up your tracking and mess up your commingling if you're not careful with those types of funds that are producing extreme returns. Marginal tax rate mismatch. So this is something that happens. It doesn't necessarily make a strategy fail more often than not, but it can temper your results to a point where they are no longer what you expect. So if you start the strategy and you have a house and your marginal tax rate is in like the 40% range, like a really, really high marginal tax rate, you're going to get a lot of benefits from the tax refunds that you generate through the strategy. If we make those projections based on your marginal tax rate at 40%, and then in 10 years you decide, I don't need to work this hard, I'm going to drop down to a part-time position and only have a marginal tax rate of 20%. Now the tax breaks that you're getting from all the tax deductible expenses are going to be cut in half. And that's going to make a big impact on the results that we talked about for your strategy. So if you're planning to retire or semi-retire or take a step back at any point during the strategy, we have to make sure that we account for that in the strategy and lower the expectations accordingly, because they will not be as strong as they were when you had a 40% tax rate. That's just a function of how taxes work. Forced liquidation from life events. So I often talk about, I'm kind of famous for talking about, you don't need a safety account. I believe in that wholeheartedly. I think money sitting in your bank account, especially when you're doing Smith Maneuver, is just a waste of potential. If you keep 20 grand in a savings account, just in case something happens, that $20,000 is doing nothing for you. The moment you spend any money out of that account, you're going to build it right back up to $20,000. Why are you doing that? It's much more efficient to have a section of your HELOC that's dedicated as an emergency account. So $20,000 worth of HELOC room that's separate from any investment HELOC that you're using, and keep that empty unless you need it. And then if you need it, pay it back. Just like you would in the safety account, it works exactly the same, except it's much more effective for you in reducing your tax deductible mortgage. But non-tax deductible mortgage. But if you don't have something in place, either a safety account or a dedicated portion of your HELOC, when a life event happens and you can't cover it, the Smith Maneuver is not going to be very flexible in terms of giving you extra cash. If you sell some assets, you can't just then use that money for a personal expense. You would actually have to pay back the entire investment amount in order to free up extra capital, which you would have to then use for personal reasons. So you want to make sure you plan ahead and give yourself a good safety account there. Misconception. So now we're going to talk about less so failing points, things that are going to make the strategy fail, and more so about misconceptions that people have, that they think will make it fail or think will be problematic, and often are just a little bit wrong. So let's talk about those. Misconception number one: if the stock market crashes, I'm going to lose my house. No, if the stock market crashes, you're not going to lose your house. The only way you get a negative effect from the stock market going down or correction or crash is if you sell the assets when that happens. The whole point of the Smith Maneuver is to give you the best possible way to avoid that needing to be the case. There's two main reasons that the Smith Maneuver is excellent for avoiding that. First, the Smith Maneuver encourages, and actually by its own nature kind of forces you to do what's called dollar cost averaging, or DCA. What that is it's when you take a regular amount of money every regular amount of time and continue investing it one after the other. So for example, if you take $100 a month and invest it each month on the first day of the month, that's DCAing. With the Smith Maneuver, every month you're going to make payments, you're going to reduce your principal, you're going to take it out of the HELOC and make payments. Not often in the Smith Maneuver are you taking massive lump sums to invest all at once. When you do that, now your cost for all the assets that you're buying is going to be averaged out. So whether or not the stock market is doing this, you're buying at these intervals. And so it averages out to not the best time to buy, not the worst time to buy, but just a time to buy overall. And so you can reduce a lot of that risk that way. The other thing is the Smith Maneuver is strictly meant to be a long-term strategy. So if you come to me and say, hey, I have 5 years, what can I do with the Smith Maneuver? I'm going to say, don't do it, because it's not worth it. I would never do Smith Maneuver for 5 years. It's too risky. Anything can happen in 5 years. 10 years is my minimum, realistically. And I'd far prefer working with people that have 15, 20, 30-year time horizons to really maximize the benefits and minimize the risks of the Smith Maneuver. So if in a 20-year time horizon there's a market crash, there is a ton of time left to recover from that market crash and still get the overall average benefit that we're looking to get. And that's why it's important to have that long time horizon. I always think about the saying, time in the market is better than timing the market. Keep it long, invest regularly, and don't worry about it. You don't have to be a savvy investor. You just have to be a consistent investor. Next thing, next misconception, it increases my total net debt. Smith Maneuver, when it's executed correctly, generally does not increase your total net debt. There's one accelerator called Prime the Pump that will use some extra equity, and that's a totally optional accelerator if you want to use it. I give a big talk and caveat about that specific accelerator before anyone that I work with uses it, just to make sure they understand it is actually increasing the amount of debt that they have. Other than that, the Smith Maneuver is meant to maintain your debt level. So if you're at $500,000 of debt currently today, in 25 years, the Smith Maneuver is going to have you at $500,000 worth of debt if executed correctly. That's the whole point. It's debt neutral, it's cash flow neutral. It doesn't cost any more money month over month, and it allows you to keep the same amount of debt, but get much more benefit out of it. So even though your debt stays flat the entire 25 years, your investments are going to grow to a point where you're generating a fair amount of wealth and using your funds much more effectively. It does require a bit of a change in mindset. Most people are excited to see their debt go down. You have to change your mindset from excited to see your debt go down to excited to see your net wealth go up. That is the number you really want to concentrate on, and that's the benefit that Smith Maneuver provides. Misconception number 3, rising interest rates will completely destroy my strategy. No, that's just not true. Right now, when I do a strategy for someone, I use prime plus 0.5 as their line of credit, or the home equity line of credit interest rate. That is pretty standard. Right now, that's 4.95. It could go up or it could go down in the future, but right now it's 4.95. After I've shown someone their result, I will almost always go back to that number and play with it to show them how much flexibility they have in it. So if they're very profitable or they can build a lot of wealth at 4.95, I'll put it up to 7, which is a very uncommon rate for us to have for any length of time, let alone a 25-year time horizon, but it's very uncommon. But I'll put it up to 7. And the Smith Maneuver is almost always still very profitable. Then I'll put up to 8 or 10, and I'll see where that breaking point is. And I have to go to a point that would be ridiculous for the line of credit to maintain for any length of time, let alone the 25 years. When we're doing the calculations, we're using an average of what we think it's going to be. 4.95 is a pretty good average. And if it goes up or down for a short time, so be it. Overall, we're going to get the right tax benefits from that. So a rising rate, we have a ton of flexibility in there. It's very unlikely to have a rate that's so high it's prohibitive for the Smith Maneuver. But is it possible? Sure. There's probably going to be bigger problems, and it probably will be very short-lived. So on average, it's almost impossible for that to happen. Misconception number 4, the bank is going to suddenly recall my HELOC. The bank is supportive of clients that are in good standing. So if you're making your payments and there's no red flags for your account, the bank has very little incentive to do anything. They do technically have the right to recall your HELOC. That is within their rights. So that's something you should know. However, if you think about it from a consumer's perspective, if a bank started recalling HELOCs randomly at any time, the reputation of that bank would be so badly damaged, it would actually materially affect a bank's ability to do business with anyone that wants to do any investment loans. So a bank is extremely incentivized to continue business as normal in those regards. If a world event happened where there's a major financial correction or major financial crash and banks were forced to make some changes to safeguard themselves, the more likely route is that they would go ahead and freeze HELOCs as needed. Now, if they freeze HELOC mid Smith Maneuver on you, it's likely very temporary, likely only during that financial crisis. And it's likely, and it's possible for you to pause your Smith Maneuver generally while they do that. You can go back to doing your business without Smith Maneuver for a short time if that's required. But the chances are for the entire length of time that you have the HELOC and the mortgage, as long as you're in good standing, you will be able to continue functioning as normal, no matter what. Misconception number 5, the CRA will shut down the Smith Maneuver because it's a tax loophole. The Smith Maneuver is not really a tax loophole. It's just using the tax laws as they're written to your advantage. It's not a loophole. It's not something crazy unexpected. It's just an investment loan. Those are very, very common. And the Smith Maneuver is allowing regular homeowners in Canada to take advantage of that particular facet of the tax law. And so it's not likely to be shut down. In fact, the Smith Maneuver has been around since the 1980s. It's been tried and tested through financial stress times. It's been tried and tested through the CRA and through the Supreme Court, and it's still here today, thriving. And it's been proven over and over again to be a legal and completely compliant strategy. Nothing proves that better than the Supreme Court case for Singleton. I love this case. I've talked about it before. Singleton is a guy who wanted to buy a house and had a law firm. He pulled some equity out of his law firm, $300,000, in order to buy a house in that cash, using cash, no mortgage. He then took a mortgage on that house to invest back into his law firm. And so the CRA said, hey, you can't do that. That's clearly you're just avoiding tax. You're using the same money in different ways. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that because he used the money from the mortgage to invest in the law firm, even though he was clearly doing a circular movement with the money, because it was used for investment purposes, it passes the test. It's going to be a tax deductible loan. And so there's cases like that that have proven that the Smith Maneuver is legal. There are some areas that still need definitive proof, and those are the gray areas that I've already spoken about. But there's fantastic cases like that have proven over and over again. This is a legitimate strategy. It's a legitimate way to pay less tax and build long-term wealth. And I want to finish on one last thing. When our parents were buying their houses in the 1980s and 70s, or whenever your parents were born, it was a very different landscape to what it is now in a couple of ways. First, people were making more income relative to the price of house at that time. So price of houses were often like 4 times your income. Right now, a price of house is often 8, 9, 10 times the price of your income. And so the amount that we're stretching ourselves now just to be able to get in the market is much more. But even more so, when our parents were getting their mortgages, they were getting married and buying houses in their 20s. And that's incredibly uncommon these days. Now we're getting married and buying houses in our 30s or our 40s even. And so our parents had time to pay off their whole mortgage and then start investing and saving for the retirement and retiring comfortably. When we're starting in our 30s and 40s, we don't have time to pay off our house and then save for retirement. We have to do it all at once. And that is why the Smith Maneuver is so important for Canadians nowadays, because otherwise we're going to get to our 60s and 70s, have a paid off house, and not have any money to retire on. We need to start building our wealth now. We need to start building it more effectively, and we need to start being much more directed in what we're doing with our taxes and our funds. So a Smith Maneuver is like an all-in-one solution to that. It's legal. It's completely possible for most homeowners to do. And that's why I dedicate my whole life to showing people how to do it. So if you want to learn more, make sure you join my free course, jeffhamilton.ca/free. I teach how to do the Smith Maneuver. I teach more about it. I encourage people to do it. It's completely free, and I offer free strategy calls as well, where I walk you through your situation and make sure you know the possibilities for you with Smith Maneuver. And I actually show you the projections of what you could have by just doing exactly what you're doing now in a different way and getting better results. So take me up on that. Join my free course. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you and helping Canadians get more wealthy.